Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I have David Hernandez here with us, talking about pitfalls in building and creating Drupal websites, web applications. We did a ebook very recently on 10 project pitfalls, and we wanted to spend some time talking about these pitfalls, maybe how these risks, if properly managed, can turn out to be opportunities to put together really good projects and good experiences. And so we're going to have kind of a series that we put together, and we're going to bring in various folks. David Hernandez is our manager of learning and contributions for FFW. So he brings a tremendous amount of experience with him as a Drupalist out in the community, and certainly with us. And I think has a unique perspective on being able to um, convey some of the importance of these messages, these pitfalls that we want to avoid. The perspective being that of training other developers, and so I know he's got some particular things that he's passionate about. Feature creep, QA. We did a little bit of prep work before beginning to record this webinar, and so we're going to talk about some of those. Um, so thanks for joining me, David. Uh, this is our inaugural webinar of this particular type, right?
Yep,
So
happy to be here, Ray.
good, cool. So pitfalls. What are them? We've never had any problems developing a Drupal project. What could we possibly mean?
Right. Yeah, pitfalls are. I think this is one of those occasions where we can really help a lot of our clients and user base to use our experience to let people know about some of the common problems that we often encounter when building websites, when specing out projects, when dealing with Drupal in general, and all of the fun that gets associated with it. And I think we wanted to make sure that people are aware of some of these things so that we can, help ourselves while building projects, but also help clients, whether they're using us to build websites or hiring some other agency. These are things that you really want to look out for.
Yeah, and just when we say experience, we have the benefit of our personal and professional experience, but we also have the benefit of a lot of other people's experience, right? Because we've I think we've both been in the community for a while now. I think you I've been around for 10 plus years, and I think you've been around just as long or almost as long, right, David?
Yeah, so the two of us combined are pushing almost 20 years worth of Drupal
Oh
experience.
my God, that's crazy. Okay, let's not talk about that anymore. Um, so the point is that during that time, we've heard a lot of stories, right? And we've compared
Hmm.
notes with a lot of different people and organizations of different kinds, and it was actually pretty easy to come up with a list of pitfalls. And I think it's not like brain surgery, right? Even if you're just a
Hmm.
little familiar with Drupal, right? I mean, anybody could come up with a list like this, and probably a lot of the things on it would be fairly similar. But I think the learning is in the talking about it, right? And you never you kind of pitfalls are not like well marked, right? It's not like you're walking down the road and there's, oh look, there's a big sign that says pitfall, don't step here. It's not that. They kind of sneak up on you, right? And it's
Yeah, and a lot of these are actually fairly global and would be applicable to almost any project or any web project. So Drupal's not entirely unique. This isn't necessarily just, oh, well, if you're doing Drupal, these are massive problems you're going to encounter. It's, these are things that you want to make sure that you keep an eye out for on any web project.
Yeah, I think that's really true. They are very universal, very global. I think there are some things that are particular about Drupal that you know might make lend a certain character to this type of problem, and that you could benefit hearing about that as a way of sort of detecting it or getting it on the
Hmm.
radar before you get close enough to get drawn into it. Each of these, avoiding these pitfalls are sometimes actually difficult, right? Like they have an inertia to them that they pull people in, right, to it. It's like, one of the pitfalls is, not doing enough of a discovery, and discovery obviously is a huge portion of your planning, right? And uh, what are the things that affect your ability to plan? Well, time, right? Budget. A lot of these things are difficult to manage, so it becomes very difficult to not get pulled into these pitfalls. Should we call them pitfalls, or should we call them project, black holes, and that they can really suck you into? So, as far as setting the
Yeah, a lot
stage,
of them are early factors in projects where if you don't avoid them or plan carefully, they really can snowball. Especially when you're dealing with different phases of a project where people involved in later phases were not involved in earlier phases, and things that happen in those earlier phases can affect them later on in the project.
yeah, I like that phrase, early factors in particular, because what I think that part of the message here with publishing the ebook and talking about it like this is, well, you know, as you're beginning to contemplate your project, you can have this list of pitfalls in front of you, and say, okay, how are we going to make sure we avoid that? And involve everybody, even if they're only involved in one or two parts of your site. You can involve everybody in making sure that you steer clear of these. And so we've been talking about these pitfalls, but I guess what I can do is I'll name them briefly, and we want to encourage everyone to log into the site, to visit, excuse me, ffwagency.com to download the ebook. And maybe you've already been there because you're listening to this recording. But in any event, we have 10 pitfalls that we list, and we're going to begin to talk about a few of them in more detail. But we list a comprehensive discovery, or failure to do a comprehensive discovery, failure to do a rigorous content audit, the difficulty or not controlling what we refer to as feature creep adequately, not putting together carefully crafted user stories, big mistake, not ensuring that your project is going to have really strong project management, sometimes not even budgeting for project management from a perspective of time or dollars, not understanding or having a willingness to reach out to and engage, or at least liaise with specialists, right, of all different kinds, not engaging in quality assurance testing. Uh, these are all some of the most common pitfalls, and I think we don't want to forget, what was it, multi-site, right, David? Multi-site, continuous development, and the community. So if you're planning a
Hmm.
multi-site, that's a great thing, but it's also a huge pitfall if you don't approach it carefully. If you don't have a plan laid out for continuous development, that's a pitfall because you need it. And not engaging with the community, that's a common pitfall, because sometimes they can just solve so many problems so quickly with a simple conversation. So that's the list. Uh, Pick one, David.
Yeah, most of these are pretty near and dear to me, especially things like content audit, which is, I think, hugely important and undervalued by a lot of people. But I'm going to skip ahead to number 3 on our list, which is adding to feature creep. That's another one that's,
Ooh,
me
yes.
as a developer and as a site builder, what I do most of my time. Feature creep, I think, is something that's very difficult for clients often to pay attention to and realize that the sort of ramifications that kind of thing can really how it affect your project. For for people who don't know what feature creep is, I don't know if there's like a strict definition that people use for it, but it's essentially those situations where you have very maybe defined requirements for a project, and then you're always going to have meetings during the continuous phases of a project through design, through development, testing, and all that. And you always have meetings where you check with the clients, check with your developers, and people start coming up with ideas for things like, oh, we forgot to think about this, and what about this situation, or what about that thing, we didn't fully think about it, or can we put something here, or I then later saw something on another website, and I always hate that phrase, I saw this thing on another website.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that always leads to trouble. And that's feature creep. You get little features that start creeping themselves in, and at the end of your project, you end up with something that can be a bit of a monster that looks like if you ever watched The Simpsons, when Homer goes to work for his brother and he develops that car, and they start asking his opinion for all the different things that someone wants in the family sedan, and they
Right.
get that weird monstrosity at the end of it that's got all kinds of weird things all over it. That's the kind of thing that you end up with on feature creep. Um,
Or you
so
end
what I would
up with nothing at all because it just paralyzes you. It's really a
Yeah,
serious
where
issue.
you end up taking too long, you go over budget, your project just takes much longer than you realize, or even like little things. You might have a small project, but then little things can work themselves in that you don't realize might add to development time or complexity and things like that. And I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons why people do this. One is um, people think of websites as like a defined product, and there's like something that you would physically produce, like an automobile or a magazine, and they're thinking, well, I got to get all the things in that I really need or that I'm thinking of that might
Yeah.
be high in the sky or anything, and I want to make sure that they're in, because once this is done, like it's going to go up, and like that stuff's going to be there, and I'm not going to touch it or anything. And I don't think you really want to look at your project that way. What you really should think about is, in the state that you're in now, what are the things that you really need? What's driving your content? And I always tell people to go back to your content. Go back to your original plan when you first kicked off the project, right? When you did a content audit, don't think about the features on a site. Don't think about how they're laid out. Don't think about how they're presented. Just think about what communication goal you have, what it is that you're trying to communicate to
What's your
users,
message,
how are you
right?
organizing your content. And then think about layout later, think about design later. Those are always later phases. And then when you get to the point where you're starting to build out features, always make sure that you're keeping an eye on that original content structure that you had. And if somebody wants to add a new feature, do you have the content for it? Is the content driving that feature? Or is the feature just some bell and whistle that you saw someplace and you need to add a site somewhere, but you don't have the content for it, and the feature is not solving a problem. That's what site features really should do. When it comes to design, when it comes to functionality, they should really be solving a content problem. How do you present this information in a way that's easily consumed by your users?
That's right.
If you're
And
adding a feature that doesn't do that, then forget about it. And that's what's adding to feature creep.
and they need
So
and it should be really features should be really integral to your messaging and your
mm-hmm.
content, and if they're not, and you may have some that's ancillary or supportive, but you should be able to rank them by priority, right? And you know that if they're not really integral to your content and to your messaging, well then how essential are they? And sort of weigh the additional complexity or the risk of something unanticipated with the benefit of adding in a feature that you're not quite sure you really need.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Prioritization of your content and features is key. Right? This thing that you're adding because you saw a widget someplace, like what is it actually doing for you? Is it communicating anything? Is it supporting the information that's already on the page? Is it what is its purpose?
So
And do
now,
you have anything to drive it?
do you think that Drupal is I want to say particularly prone, or maybe you feel that way, but do you think that this is something that especially Drupal folks developing in Drupal for the first time should be especially cautious about? Do you think it's more so than, say, a different system? I know I have my opinions about
Yeah,
it, but I want
there's kind of a double-edged sword there because Drupal is so modular and so flexible, and there's so many different modules that you can get on Drupal.org that you can download and add features to your site. There is a propensity for some people to think, oh, just go download this thing and I'll install it
yeah.
and it'll add this new feature to my site. Oh,
So
this
we
is
feel the
great. I'll
same
just go and
way.
get another thing and another thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then before your project is over, you've got like 200 extra modules that you've installed, and you don't need half of them, and some are doing different things, and then you start getting into like maintenance issues and performance problems, and you have to be really careful about those kinds of things.
Yeah, and
But on the plus side, no, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. Well, there is a plus side to that, but before you can get there, you have to make sure that you don't, gorge yourself on all this awesome functionality that's available in the contrib, um, uh, you know, area on Drupal on Drupal.org/project. And when I train, I always use the analogy of a kid in a candy store, right? It's like you go in, you see lots of stuff, and you come out, and that's not going to take you very long before you have a tummy ache, right? And no matter what our age, it's we go in and we're enticed by all this great functionality. 12 different ways to do something in Drupal. Well, what's right for this particular project? What's right for your organization? And sometimes none of it, and it should be saved for a separate course or a separate phase of development, right? I think that Drupal is a little bit more prone to other to this than other projects. You're not required to pay anything, right? To
Mm-hmm.
download this functionality, give it a try, and this modular nature makes it very easy for you to test things out. And then you pay a price in so many different ways, which we can keep talking about. But I think we should also get to your point of on the bright side, right? There's a real benefit.
Yeah, the bright side is because Drupal is so modular that it supports your ability to do what we call progressive enhancement, which don't think of your site at launch as just being this defined project that's done, a singular product, never going to get touched for a couple of years. No, you will have a next phase, and if you then come up with the content need for one of these new features, it's not too difficult to then add it because it's Drupal so modular. And as a developer, when you're actually building things with Drupal, if you're creating custom modules, themes, things like that, just pay attention to how you're doing things and do it in the Drupal way so that you maintain that flexibility that Drupal already has, and when you need to make enhancements in the future, they're very easy to do because you haven't done weird things like hack through the code and built out your functionality in a way that's not flexible and can't be changed later on.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's an important message, right? So the end result of feature creep, it shouldn't be like a downer, right? It's like, oh man, we're not going to get to do all this fun stuff. Well, yes, you are, but you want to make sure that it gets done in a smart, reasonable, uh, less risky fashion. One where you want to get off the ground as quickly and as gracefully as possible, and then start adding some of these essential or subsequent sets of um, behaviors and features to your site. That's one of the great things, right? Like you can morph your site into different things, gradually, sometimes even radically. But by getting your initial site off the ground, what you need at launch, um, allows you to do so many things. It allows you to have a win, right? It allows you to succeed. It allows you to experience a Drupal launch from A to Z, and to learn. And then there's, as long as you've planned it out proper, there's no penalty that for then going back and adding that feature later. There's really only a gain, I think, to it.
Yeah, with the building block nature of Drupal, it's really that complicated to, shift some of the Legos around and put something in place that you really needed. So at launch, that MVP, pay attention to, as I said originally, your content audit, what it is that you really need this site to do, and individual pages to do, individual content types, sections of your site, what are you actually doing? And pay attention to your content editors, right? People don't realize that as well, is that if you start getting feature creep and start adding lots of bells and whistles to the site structure and things that are needed to build pages, is that supporting your content editor? Right? Or you ended up in a situation where you actually you're increasing the burden on them to produce pages because now you're making basically you're increasing the set of requirements to building out a single page so that it includes all these little bells and whistles that you may not need or even have.
Exactly. And if they're new to Drupal to begin with, that just places an unnecessary burden on them, and it reduces their ability to be successful significantly, because there's more to learn, more to understand, more to worry about, a little more risk to manage. You mentioned two things. We talked about the content audit, but you also, David, I was glad, mentioned MVP, right? So the concept of a minimum viable product is so key when you're considering Drupal products, and it really fits very nicely in with, I think, most of the time what we wind up developing in. It slots nicely into this concept of hybrid agile development methodologies, right? Whereas at one end you have this sort of waterfall perspective, like we're going to plan our project out really, really carefully, and there are all these dependencies laid out, and we're not going to deliver to the client until we can give them exactly what they asked for, right? And there's real risk, and it's not really a modern way of building things. And then on the other side of it, there's strict agile development methodology, which is kind of scary for a lot of folks, because it's not as defined as folks are normally used to expecting. But the hybrid methodology, where you can do a little bit of that connecting the different dependencies, certainly, but also have organized sprints and iterate and provide some functionality, that gets folks thinking in terms of building a website or a web application in different phases, right? Because a sprint is a phase. And then they get to see that functionality, right? And then it allows them to really get their minds and their arms around a minimum viable product, and it allows them to pivot around whether or not they've created something that they think their customers, their constituents, are going to value. Gee, we thought we would do this feature for our clients, and now that we see it, we have trouble understanding whether or not they're going to find that really helpful, right? So let's pivot just a little bit to the left or to the right and do something slightly different. And so that's one of the major benefits of controlling feature creep, is you don't start out building something that's so heavy that you can't pivot when you realize an opportunity for it. So I think,
and especially if you, as maybe a site owner, don't have the breadth of experience that someone like FFW has, because we're an agency and we've built hundreds of websites. So we kind of understand what these features might actually do or not do, or how it might actually work or not work, and the user research involved and things like that. It's also why we're big on things like producing prototypes for people.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's really hard to wrap your mind around how something might work in, say, responsive design, or how a feature might actually look and behave when you're clicking on it and things like that. So we build out prototypes in the early phase and can show you this is how that's going to behave and how it's going to work. And here you can see the problem that I discussed with you earlier that you couldn't quite visualize, but now that you see it in a web browser and see how these two things interfere with each other or act funny, things like that, and those kinds of things can be really important.
That's the great thing about working with the web and working with Drupal. You know, a prototype or sometimes even a full proof of concept. And I think that we're in a much better position to do this in an affordable manner and an expeditious manner with Drupal 8 than we have been, you know, previously with any other version of Drupal. And we don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole, but it's I and, you know, tell me what you think, David. But I think it's actually the incentive to control feature creep and the ability to control feature creep is significantly greater and improved with Drupal um, 8 because it really allows you so many more options with decoupling the front end or progressively decoupling a front end so that you can use, maybe you create a prototype in JavaScript or some other front end library, and you know you've got, you know, some front end help actually on staff, right? And maybe you're engaging a company like FFW that's got some back end specializations, as of course some front end specialization, design and planning as well. But now you can get even more mileage out of a prototype, out of a proof of concept, because Drupal 8 can be, you know, so much more readily connected to that particular front end technology that you've used. And I again, I think that's helps you control feature creep, you know, because you can deploy that code or you can save it and it still be reused later on.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, having worked on some Drupal 8 sites and working on some now, even that the prototyping build is so much easier, simpler in Drupal 8 than any of the previous versions, and being able to transfer the work done in the prototype directly to the Drupal site is a lot more straightforward and more accurate now in Drupal 8 than I think it's ever been before.
Yeah, I mean, I remember sitting in front of a client and they were telling me, you know, oh, we've got a, you know, contract with an agency and they've done a whole, you know, uh, from you know, project for us and they want to reuse the code. And that should be possible with Drupal, right? And I'm like, yeah, well, you know, yes, possible, but practical, it might be another thing. And Drupal 8 was still, you know, a couple years away at the time. And now I would have a completely different reaction to that, right? I think what would I say? I think I would say, well, if they had, if the front end, if the prototype was built, you know, in a standards compliant manner, then it shouldn't be that difficult, you know, to connect it with a back end Drupal. And you know, let's begin to scope that out. You know, I would have a totally different reaction to it.
Yeah, much more straightforward than it's probably ever been before.
Yeah.
Um, and I think earlier you said a key thing, you used a great word, which was success. And a lot of this is, you know, we bring up issues related to pitfalls and bring it up during early phases of projects and continuation during projects because that's, you know, success is what we're really thinking about when it comes to the clients. We want to make sure we're not telling you just no because we don't know how to do something or we don't like something or prefer to do something a different way. We want to make sure that the project is successful. So if we're pinpointing certain things and saying, well, do you really need that? You know, we're keeping an eye on things like what is your deadline? You know, like what is your budget? You know, what is your message you're communicating, and how are you managing this content? You know, is this feature going to make that website successful? And if not, then maybe that's something that we should cut out. Not because of our own preferences or biases or anything like that, but we want to make sure that these websites work the best way that they possibly can.
Yeah, and that's something that I mean, it's no surprise that David, that you and I get on, arrive at that, you know, conclusion. I mean, because it's really part of the DNA at FFW, and it had been, you know, even before we became FFW, we different shops that came together really felt that way. This idea of not letting the customer fail, right? And I like to think that there are a lot of organizations that do that, but it's sort of like built into to our DNA, and what we try to do, like talking about it, is not just to say, "Oh yeah, we're a really great organization, come work with us," but we talk about it, frankly, because we want to raise expectations, right? So if folks that are out there and listening to this, when you go and talk to vendors or you're hiring a developer, right, you can ask them questions that related to this, like, you know, I have a project coming up, and there's this really, this is what we need to do, but there are all these other great features. How would you handle it? What would you handle, and what would you suggest? And engage them in conversations. And I'm not saying you use it as a litmus test, but engage them in these types of conversations. And you want to hear from them the things that will help you go fast, but go smart, right? So you don't, go very speedily into one of these big holes that will cause you damage and be very difficult to get yourself out of. So,
Yeah, definitely. I think all the pitfalls in this list, for the most part, would be characterized that way. If you're dealing with any agency, you should ask them about these things, because, like if someone you're dealing with is not going to have a robust discovery process, I would be concerned about that, because how well are they going to understand the features that your site currently has, or what it is that you need, or what is your content audit? If they're not willing to do that, are they going to be able to prevent pitfalls of other kinds, like feature creep and things like that, if they don't truly understand what that starting point is, and what it is you're trying to actually accomplish?
yeah, it's so true. Yep, yep, yep. Awesome. Well, I feel like we're at a natural point where we get to spin the wheel again and pick the next pitfall to talk about and
Sure.
to.
I will go for, I'll skip down a little bit to number 5, which is a discussion about skimping on testing, the QA
Ooh,
process.
love it, love it, love it, love it. Yeah,
This one in particular might be one of the ones that gets skipped the most.
yeah, I agree.
And that's unfortunate. I mean, when we say QA, we're talking about quality assurance. That means testing of every kind. Like here at FFW, we have a pretty robust QA process and departments full of professionals who basically do this kind of thing for a living. And there's a real advantage to having that, right? Because they are people who understand how to properly test things. They come up with test plans. They write automated tests. And all of that is really, I think, undervalued for a lot of projects, because this is the group of people that are going to prevent problems from occurring on a live site, right? So you have developers that build something, and the assumption with a lot of people is, well, if you get quality developers, they should be able to just avoid bugs or find them themselves, so you don't really need QA. But that almost never happens. I don't care how good your developers are. I've worked with some developers who are some of the best in the world, and they will always have bugs. That's just the way it is. Because when you're the person who builds something, you're basically too close to the original code. You're too close to the product itself, the ideas, and you're not going to notice the mistakes that you make. It's kind of like if you're drawing a picture. Usually it's difficult for you to realize like your scale is off or things like that, because you're the one doing it and you're constantly staring at it all the time. And when you're constantly staring at the same thing, you don't notice little things that are off. But when you get a new set of eyes that show up, someone who's not emotionally connected to the project, someone who hasn't been there and poring over the code and has been dealing with the same thing for like days on end, they have a fresh set of eyes, and they will catch little problems that you didn't discover before. And as a developer, you're constantly sort of dealing with the thing you're building in the same way, whereas another person who understands how to properly test something will know, let me try to do something you didn't think about. Let me use this in a different way. Let me actually go through all the pages. Let me go through every page and check every feature on every page, and let me check it on different responsive styles, and let me try to enter things in the search box that you didn't think to enter because you always use the same thing. Like you always use the same text whenever you typed in, and you didn't try special characters and
Yeah,
numbers. QA departments are very systematic that way. and it's very good for them to be separated from your normal development department.
Yeah,
And
it's
it's good to
so
have
true.
these professionals. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's so true, and you started to say it's so good to have these professionals. I mean, it both, the job of a developer and the job of a QA analyst or QA engineer, they're both creative jobs in a way, but they're both so differently creative, right? The developer is building something, and the QA person, in a productive way, is trying to break something, right?
Hmm.
And so they're totally different processes, and a developer will go and they'll lay down 70-80% of the code, and you don't want to have them spend so many more hours trying to figure out the final 20% because it's not finished yet. They have to build out the rest of the application before they worry about every little detail of the first part of it, and then they can sort of then they do go back and organically build, create the whole, bring the whole application up to 90-95% functionality, and that's when you have your QA team come in and focus on that really hard to identify final uh, percentage, and you know according to the specific needs of certain users. So they're totally different skill sets. They're totally different jobs. I think that's a key consideration, right? And then
Yeah,
we've
it's
got
not
there
just.
there are QA engineers and there are QA analysts, right, David? I mean, it's even within
Mhm.
QA departments, there are different types of folks.
Yeah, I was going to say it's not just skill set; it's also mindset.
Yeah,
So I've even done both myself. I've done QA work and I've done development work, and it's very difficult to do it on the same project. I could QA someone else's project and then have a different person QA my own project, but to do it on the same is quite difficult. You just have to put yourself in a certain mindset of, like, how am I going to attack this site, and like, build spreadsheets and go through every page and check every feature and click on every little button and all that sort of stuff. But when it's a project you've worked on yourself, it's very difficult. And this is really important, I think, for clients to understand as well, because what often happens is if somebody doesn't have, again, just like discovery, if they don't, an agency doesn't have a robust testing workflow, what they're going to end up doing is build something in the way they know how with their developers, and then they're basically going to give it to you, and they're going to have
right,
you do the testing. And
right.
that's generally a phase that we call UAT, which is user acceptance testing, where we're giving it to you as a client. Say, look it over, make sure you check everything. Different than, say, like, you have someone do construction on your home and they come and put in a new kitchen. They have you come and do like a quick inspection, and yeah, everything looks fine, I'll sign off. Like, you're the final sign off, but are you going to be able to identify all these different bugs? If you're just a client, maybe you work in marketing, maybe you work in IT, or you're a project manager, do you know how to thoroughly test a web project and find all these little things and report them and make sure every little thing works in every page and every feature works exactly to spec, and know all the different ways that you have to test things? Most of the time, the answer is no. And I know that from experience because I haven't always worked for an agency. I've worked for organizations where I've been the client with agencies, and I know that um, clients don't always test every little thing the way they should. And you sign off on it, you get it, and then you launch your project, and eventually you will find those problems because someone who's using your site will find those problems. You'll discover them. And if you don't have a post-launch contract with that agency or long-term maintenance, maybe it's something that you don't discover for a month or two later, and you're past that launch phase. You might be in trouble. You're going to have somebody fix those problems. But if you make sure that agency has robust testing, which is what we do, we're going to find those first because we want to find those problems before we even get to a user acceptance testing phase. We don't want you to see those problems. We want basically a polished product before we give it to you.
Yeah, that's and any developer should, and any development firm should, and it's just not practically possible without a team, a set of individuals that are performing that function, and ideally have a specialization in doing that. And there are all sorts of ways to accomplish QA testing. We have less technical and more technical ways of doing that. Sometimes one, sometimes the other method, sometimes both methods, depending upon the type of project that's being run. And testing, you know, tests for all sorts of things, whether or not the site is secure, whether or not it's performant, whether or not it's, what you asked for.
Testing for accessibility.
Oh my gosh, so important. So many fields that face, compliance issues and expensive compliance issues when that type of testing is not done and carefully. Yeah.
Yeah, and as you said, there's a lot of manual testing that people do, and automated testing is really big now. It's so important for long-term maintenance because if you're it's another thing that I would want clients to truly understand. Like when we're building out a project, we would like to add more time to a testing phase and actually build out automated tests, especially if you have a larger project. If you have something really small that's mostly about content and the design, maybe less important, but if you're building something that really is feature-rich and has custom code and is really doing something important, maybe integrating with other services and doing all kinds of different things, it's really important to have automated testing for that, because as you develop those next phases after launch, and you've got a second phase and a third phase, and a year from now you're adding new features and making changes, if you have automated testing in place for the software that you've written, that's the thing that basically stops you from introducing regressions, introducing problems into your website. Because as somebody else, whether it's the person who originally built the site or another developer working with that same agency, or maybe you end up hiring another agency, if those tests are there and someone starts to make modifications, what you do is you run those automated tests, and they will find problems that you start to introduce and find them before you actually get production ready. That's the point of that automated testing. It's big in Drupal now. A lot of open source projects have automated testing built in. Drupal has lots of automated testing built into Drupal itself, which is how we can sort of ensure the stability of Drupal. But everything that gets developed on Drupal.org, patches, new features, things like that, goes through an entire automated testing process that's run by the Drupal Association. It's on Drupal.org. So you can see as these patches go up, there's something like 50,000 test assertions that get run on individual patches, and they have to pass, or else those code changes don't get committed. And when you're building custom code on your own project, those are things that you can add and have your developers add, so that you can ensure 6 months from now, if somebody goes and even just changes a setting or some little bit of code, maybe you find a bug somewhere, make sure you run those tests again to ensure that you're not creating problems, maybe with even some other piece of code that you might think is completely unrelated to what it is that you're changing.
Yeah, it is so, especially if you have, you may have really good developers, but if they're not experienced in Drupal, I think this was particularly so with Drupal 7 and earlier versions, but it's still the case with Drupal 8. You build something in one part of your house and something elsewhere, a completely different part of the house, breaks. And it doesn't break immediately. It breaks, later when that particular instance comes up. And I think we're doing a lot to. We did a lot in Drupal 8 to mitigate that, but still, the first line of defense is QA testing for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the real pitfall here for people, the takeaway is don't think that you won't make mistakes. Right?
Don't think
you
that
have
your
to
developers
assume,
won't make mistakes. Yep, or your site builders.
Yeah,
yep.
Everyone. I mean, everyone involved in the process is going to make mistakes and make it on every single phase. Like you might make a mistake in your content audit, in your discovery. You might make a mistake in the design. You might make a mistake in development. I mean, you should go into every project assuming that mistakes were made. And this is what testing is for, to catch those mistakes at some point, and then you will correct them before you go into production.
Yep. Yep. Awesome. Awesome. So successful quality assurance testing finds lots of mistakes, and it's not in something that reflects on your development team. It's reflective of the type of project that you're working on, and the integrity of your QA process. Yeah, yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And good. So we've covered 2 pitfalls. Are we going to go for a third, David?
Sure. Let's see. How about we talk about multi-site? That's another
Oh
good
my
one.
gosh! Wow, you really wanna
I like hitting all the technical ones.
yeah,
Great.
we're gonna attempt to get our arms around an iceberg
Yeah.
with multi-site. Multi-site's a big one, a really important one, because the benefits of multi-site are big, like an iceberg. But the problems and the risk, if you don't do it carefully, you don't think it through, are big, like an iceberg. Um, so, so how do you begin to get your, well, first of all, let's define multi-site, right? A lot of people define it very differently in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, and this is probably the more Drupal-y focused one of the ones we've discussed so far.
Yep, yep, I agree.
Because multi-site is, different software projects have the ability to do something like multi-site, but some of the pitfall we're discussing here are, how Drupal itself does multi-site and what are some of the mistakes that you can make. Now, multi-site basically means, if you imagine you have a group of sites, say you have 5 of them, and you're going to make 5 different sites, you might think, well, I'll have to download Drupal and install it in a directory, build that site, and then I'll do it again. I'll have to download and install Drupal in another directory and build a site, and then do it again, do it again, do it again. And then you end up with 5 directories with 5 Drupal installations in them, and copies of modules and themes and anything you might need.
Right.
But with multi-site setup, what you can basically do in Drupal is sort of combine those sites onto one, at least combine those directories. So you end up with one directory that has Drupal in it. And then inside that Drupal directory, you can create multiple site directories. And if you get started with Drupal and look at how you set up a site, you'll see that immediately. It's all in the instructions. There's this sites directory, and you create multiple directories in there, and you basically just have the configuration and customization for that site. And that would basically let you make pretty much any number of sites in one installation directory. So you can have 100 in there. You can have 1,000 probably if you want to. I don't think I've done anything that big, but we have done, at FAW we've done ones that have hundreds, certainly. And so the advantage is you can put everything basically in one directory. Any code that you have, so you've got, say, Drupal 8, you have basically one copy of Drupal 8, so whenever you need to update it, you basically update that one directory of code. If you've got modules that all those sites use, or most of them, or some of them, you could have one copy of that module, which means one directory full of code, and if they all share a theme, you could have one theme directory and one copy of that stored basically in that directory. And then when you have to do individual things, you manage the sites separately. So you can still go to your web browser and log in and turn features on and off and add content, and the sites are still completely separate from each other, but you can just keep them all in one directory. And that can make it much easier to manage. So if you do updates, if you have to move anything around, you're as a product owner, you basically have just this one place where you own everything and you manage this whole system. But there's certainly downsides to doing that. And one of them is kind of the maintenance burden. And the maintenance burden, you look at it 2 different ways based on whether you're using multi-site or not. So the maintenance burden, if you don't use it, is, say you have 150 websites, you then have 150 different Drupal directories that you have to keep control of. And if you have to update Drupal, you have to go into all 150 of them and update the software. And you might think that that's going to be a big problem for you. And it, in the past, can be a big problem, which is why people developed the ability to do multi-site. But there's also a maintenance burden if you are doing multi-site, which is you now have all these sites sharing a code base, so you have to essentially treat them all like one product. So if you update Drupal for one of the sites, you have to update it for all of them, right? You can't manage the maintenance for them really individually from each other. You have to think of them all as one big product. And that can be problematic, right? So if you have a site that's slightly different from another site and needs a different version of a module, or you know that within a specific update of a module or Drupal itself, it has a certain bug that affects something you're doing in one of the sites, and you don't want to update it, that means you can't update any of your sites because you have to basically hold back because of one of them. And you know that has its own maintenance burden. We have to really keep track of what's going on and what the individual sites are doing. So my recommendation is think about really how much control you have, because the more control you have over the sites and the more similar the sites are, the more likely you will be successful in multi-site. Once they start diverging from each other, that's when this really becomes a pitfall. So
that is a
key
identifier right there. I think that's the biggest one to help folks navigate this concept of a multi-site. You know, so if you're building front-facing brochure sites and you got 100 of them, you know, that's one set of code. And then if you're building, you know, an intranet or 3 of them, that's a different code base there, right? I mean, there's a lot of it's going to be the same, right? All core Drupal will be the same, but the functionality required to run an intranet is significantly different from the functionality required to run a brochureware site. So I agree completely, David. Like, how different are your sites? And let that be your guiding, you know, marker.
Yeah, like if you don't think of your sites as being one structure, one product, then you probably don't want to put them into a multi-site. There's no reason for it. So if you have 5 sites and the 5 sites have nothing to do with each other, they don't share features, they don't have similar designs, so they're not using the same theme, there's no reason to put them together in a multi-site. You're only going to create headaches for yourself. Those sites are managed differently because they have different features, they have different designs. You might have different people working on them. You might have different product owners. You probably have different content editors for them. So manage them as separate directories, as separate products. If, on the other hand, you have something, as you said, like products, right? If you're a marketing director and you work for a company that produces certain products and you have 100 websites because they're all for these different products, but the sites you've designed them to relatively work the same. Maybe they look a little different and they've got different content, but you sort of churn them out like duplicates of each other in a way. And we build systems like that for different companies. You know, that's usually an occasion to use multi-site because those sites are going to have a lot of the exact same features. Maybe they all have different themes, but they all have the same content architecture and the same software. You know, the same modules are installed in all of them, things like that. And one person owns them all. To me, that's really the key. If you have one group, one person, one department, whatever, that actually owns all of those sites together as a singular product and can manage them, then you're going to be successful. If you have less control over individual sites, they shouldn't be part of that multi-site. So if you're building out a big system and some of the sites are going to be owned by someone else and you can't control what the features are, you can't control when they get updated or how they get updated or how they're getting touched, separate those sites. Do yourself a favor, pull them out. Even if you are using a lot of the same features and you just have to copy those features into that other installation, do it, because that's going to make your life a lot easier. I've encountered this a lot with, say, like university departments. You know, if you're, say, an IT director and you're building some kind of templated system where you're you're setting up these sites for departments. You know, like HR has a site, and public safety has a site, and billing has a site. And the sites basically look the same. They just have different department names in the header, and but their features are the same. They have different content editors, so you maybe want different sites because maybe you turn features on and off for them, things like that. But you as the IT director own this product, and you maintain the whole thing, and you have a staff that does it. This is your thing, and you're able to control when the updates happen. You're able to control what features are available. This is all just one thing that belongs to you. Then multi-site is probably great for that situation. We do it all the time. But as soon as you get that one department where they have to have customizations, right? They need to add modules and features that don't exist for any of the other sites. They need to control when updates happen. They need to control how content is managed. They need to control, access. They're going to hire their own developers who might come in and add customizations. They need a different look and feel and a different theme and all that kind of stuff. As soon as that starts happening, you really need to pull that site out. So even if you're going to host it, I would recommend pulling it out and hosting it on its own, because that's the site that you don't fully control. So keep it separate from the other product that you do completely control. Then you will avoid those pitfalls of maintenance and what do you do when you need to run an update, but that one site can't do it because they've made some customizations that might break, all kinds of different things. So again, the less control you have, the more likely you really need to split these sites up.
It's really
And that also affects.
It's like an exercise of identifying your outliers, right? It's like, let's find the magic number, 60-70% of your sites that are like this, right? And the others are just a little bit different or a lot different.
Yeah, and think about is someone else going to develop on that site? Because that's another burden that gets added, right? So you're building this one product that's got one install directory and one group of modules that's used by all these sites. What happens if that department has their own developer and their developer wants to work on the theme and add some custom modules and things like that? How do they get access to this directory where they need to upload things? And are you giving them access to files that might be used by other sites and they could potentially cause problems? Are you giving them access to a server where other things are located that you don't want them to have access to? How do you manage those updates? Are they going to commit code someplace and you're going to manage the deployments of their code to this multi-site that you now have? And are you going to set all that up for them? Right? If they're basically starting to act as that outlier, do yourself a favor, separate them from everyone else.
Yeah, totally. Well put. Well put. And then the benefits, of multi-site are huge in terms of managing code and security and performance and also expense in terms of doc routes and how your sites are hosted, if they're hosted remotely. But there's also a lot of other ways, to get some of those same benefits that there didn't used to be. Commands that can back up databases across different, code bases and things like that. So that should factor into your decision as well. But that's an important side of it too, right? Is the benefits of multi-site. And so we've had clients that have saved an extraordinary amount of money and time and complexity by making really smart use of multi-sites. So we're not saying, oh my gosh, stay away from multi-sites. No, what we're saying is, multi-sites can be your best friend unless you don't spend the time getting to know them and understanding them. And that's the key consideration here, right? So you want to press the pause button, really think this through. This factors into discovery. This factors into your content audits. So many different things that the decision on when and how to implement multi-site will touch, right? It's probably the biggest implementation decision, one that has significant consequences around your continuous integration, your continuous development
Mm-hmm.
process as well, right? I mean, so it's not for the faint of heart. Right? You need to have proper processes for your own IT team in place.
Yeah, and this goes back to, surprise, surprise, your discovery phase, right?
Yes.
Thinking carefully about how you are going to build these sites, deploy them, manage your content editors, user logins, things like that. How is your hosting set up? Who are you using? Are you doing it internally? Are you doing it with a Drupal-specific host? Or are you doing it with a non-Drupal-specific host? Do they know how to manage a multi-site setup with Drupal? Does your IT staff who might be managing this understand how these things properly work? What does it affect? What doesn't it affect?
Yep. Big considerations. So cool. So we've covered quite a bit of ground, I think, across some different areas here. I think for folks that are less technical and more technical, um, which is, I think, a good way to begin and end our first installment in this companion to our ebook. So we hope during the course of this webinar, or maybe before it, you've downloaded the ebook. But if you haven't, please go ahead and we talk about these things in the ebook, of course. But we're trying to add some detail and lend some richness to this discussion. David has been awesome, and I think we're going to have David. You're coming back because we're gonna talk about all of these different feature pitfalls. Excuse me. We're going to talk about all of them together, and we're also going to have some other folks, both the part of the FFW universe and the part of the larger Drupal universe. We'll have them, be a part of this discussion. We want to, for instance, give you some of the perspective of some of the folks that might be on the purchasing side, whether they're pre-sales engineers or sales people, or contract managers, product owners at different organizations. And we want to, give as much perspective on some of these pitfalls as we can. So this was a great way to start, David. I'm super happy with the quality of this discussion. It can be made better only in one way, I think, David. I don't know about you, but I want to hear from the people that have listened today and get some feedback from you all on some of the things that we've talked about, whether you agree, disagree, maybe you've got some questions. So contact us. You'll when you signed up for this recording, you've got some contact information with it. Use it. Use it to give us some feedback, and let's keep this discussion going because it's not a static thing either, right? It just changes all the time. The discussion that we have today about feature creep and QA and multi-site is much different than the conversation that we would have had, just even a year ago. So let's keep this discussion going. Parting words, David?
Oh, I think you've covered it pretty much. I mean, you're absolutely right. This needs to be a conversation, and this is, even though the list is probably something that's a conversation we should have with every client at the start of a project. Like, hey, here's that list of 10, and let's discuss each one of these and see how it relates to this project and how we can avoid these things.
Yep. Could not agree more. Well, this has been great. So thank you if you've tuned in and listened to our recording. We appreciate your time and support for Drupal. Send us your questions and your comments. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.